I burned the only road in and out 3 days ago. The flames took longer than I expected. Diesel doesn't ignite like gasoline. It pools. It crawls. It waits for the right mix of air. I had to punch holes in the tanker with a steel spike and let gravity do the work. When it finally caught, the heat rolled across the desert floor and turned the asphalt soft. The rubber seals on the loading arms melted first. Then the tires went. I watched the last working vehicle access collapse into a blackened trench. There is no coming back from that. The depot sits alone in the high desert, 40 miles from the nearest town that still had power when the emergency broadcast started stuttering. 3 above-ground tanks, a maintenance shed, a fenced perimeter topped with rusted barbed wire, 1 gate wide enough for fuel trucks. That gate is still locked. The road beyond it isn't usable anymore. I told myself I was cutting off infected movement, reducing noise, eliminating engine temptation, but that wasn't the only reason. Vehicles mean people, and people, lately, mean pressure. The smoke column from the fire carried for miles. I knew that while I stood there holding the flare, I waited for someone to show up that first night. No one did. But the motion sensor on the south fence started blinking just before dawn yesterday. It hasn't stopped since. The depot was never meant to be a place anyone stayed. It was built to transfer fuel from rail to tanker trucks. That's it. No office staff. No storefront. Just 3 vertical steel tanks set on concrete pads, each holding close to 2 million gallons. Diesel in the largest tank. Regular in the second. Premium in the third. The tanks rise above everything else out here, dull gray cylinders against flat desert scrub. The land is high desert, western plateau country, juniper brush, low sage, sand that turns hard as stone in summer and powders soft when the wind scours it. The horizon stretches so far that weather systems show themselves hours before they arrive. You can see dust plumes moving like ghosts across the flats. That visibility is why I chose this place. You can spot movement from miles out if you're up high enough. And I am. There's a metal access ladder welded to the side of Tank 2. From the top catwalk, I can see the entire perimeter fence, the access road, and the old rail spur that hasn't been used in years. The rail line curves in from the east, rusted and half buried in sand. No trains will be coming. The perimeter fence is 8 feet tall. Chain link, double-stranded barbed wire across the top. It isn't military grade, but it's something. The gate is reinforced with steel crossbars. I ran a chain through the hinge posts and welded it in place after the fire. Wind is constant up here. It whistles through the ladder rungs and hums along the tank walls. At night, the metal cools fast. It pops and contracts. Sometimes it sounds like footsteps. Sometimes like someone tapping from the inside. There's a maintenance shed near the loading rack. Corrugated metal walls. Concrete floor. No windows except a narrow slit on the west side. I sleep there. I dragged in cots and stacked old fuel filters against the doors as secondary barrier. This place was never meant to support people. I hauled in bottled water from a grocery warehouse before the highways clogged. I rationed carefully. 1 gallon a day for drinking and minimal cleaning. I collect condensation from the tanks at night when the temperature swings hard enough. It isn't much, but every ounce counts. The desert helps with one thing, silence. Sound travels far, but it also has nowhere to hide. If something moves across open ground, I hear it. If something hits the fence, the vibration carries through the posts and into the tank walls. I've learned the difference between wind and impact, between metal cooling and metal being touched. Still, isolation cuts both ways. There are no trees for concealment, but there's also no cover for me if something comes in numbers. The tanks give height, but they also box me in. The fence defines the perimeter, but it also defines the trap. Fuel itself is another risk. 2 million gallons of diesel under my feet. Another few million gallons of gasoline within 50 yards. Static electricity out here is real. One bad spark in the wrong place, and this entire facility becomes a crater. I've grounded the ladders with extra copper cable. I avoid synthetic fabrics. I move slow around the loading arms. The loading rack sits like a skeleton of pipes and valves between the tanks and the gate. Flexible hoses hang down where trucks used to connect. The concrete pad is stained dark from years of spills. I dragged an old forklift across the rack entrance to create a partial choke point. If something gets through the gate, it can't rush straight in. North side of the fence borders open scrub. South side slopes gently down toward a dry wash. The motion sensor that keeps blinking is mounted halfway along that south stretch. It's solar-powered. Old, but still functional. It triggers a small LED inside the shed when something crosses its arc. It used to blink maybe once a week. A coyote. A stray mule deer. Now it blinks every few hours. The desert nights are colder than people expect. Even in late summer, the temperature drops hard after midnight. I sit inside the shed with the door barred, listening to wind scrape sand against metal. Sometimes I climb the tank at 2 in the morning just to confirm the horizon is still empty. The smoke from the burned tanker still stains the sky faintly at dawn. The asphalt is warped and blackened where the fire settled. There's no way a vehicle is crossing that stretch without heavy equipment. That was the point. But when I climbed Tank 2 this morning, I saw something near the dry wash. Too far to identify clearly. A shape that hadn't been there yesterday. It was close enough to have crossed the sensor line. And it wasn't there by accident. When the first alerts came through, they didn't say outbreak. They said service disruption. I was at a truck stop off Interstate 40 when the televisions above the coffee counter started looping a regional emergency bulletin. Grainy footage. A hospital parking lot somewhere in Nevada. Reporters talking over each other. Words like containment and unidentified aggression. It didn't look organized. It looked confused. Cell service was still working then. I called my brother in Flagstaff. He said their local station had cut to the same footage but with no commentary. Just a crawl at the bottom advising people to remain indoors. He laughed about it. Said it was probably another viral stunt. The first real shift came with the radios. Truckers started reporting roadblocks that didn't match construction notices. CHP units rerouting traffic with no clear reason. Then one of the guys at the counter tried to tune into AM emergency frequencies and got nothing but static. Not interference, just silence. By that night, social media feeds were flooding with short clips. Shaky phone videos. People stumbling in parking lots. Police shouting commands. Someone in Arizona claiming an entire rest area had been locked down. The word infection showed up in comments before any official channel used it. 2 days later, the power grid started stuttering. Not full blackouts at first, just flickers. Rolling outages that lasted 10 or 15 minutes. Fuel stations couldn't pump during those windows. People started topping off tanks constantly. Lines formed at every major exit. I drove west that afternoon and saw the first abandoned vehicle blocking a lane, engine still running, driver door open, no one around. The next morning, the national broadcast system cut in, calm voice. Too calm. They confirmed a rapidly spreading neurological condition. Advised citizens to shelter in place. Law enforcement was engaged. They never explained why the condition caused people to bite. It took another 3 days before the tone changed. Hospitals stopped answering phones. Highway patrol frequencies filled with clipped transmissions and then cut off mid-sentence. One of the truckers I'd met at the stop tried to return to Albuquerque. He called once from the road. Said he'd seen a state trooper firing into a crowd outside a grocery store. He didn't call again. I watched the collapse in layers. First communications, then coordinated traffic control, then supply lines. Fuel deliveries stopped almost overnight. Without trucks moving, stations ran dry. Without stations, emergency vehicles stalled. Without emergency vehicles, response time stretched into hours. The infected didn't move like movie monsters. They wandered at first, disoriented, slow. But they didn't stop. They didn't retreat from pain. They gathered around sound, around motion. The first time I saw one up close was near a distribution warehouse outside Kingman. A woman in hospital scrub standing in the middle of the access road, blood on her collar, eyes unfocused. I slowed down instead of stopping. She turned toward the engine noise, not fast, just steady. There were more behind her. Emerging from the loading docks. I didn't honk. I didn't swerve close. I reversed and took a frontage road. By the time I reached the depot, official broadcasts had thinned to pre-recorded loops. Shelter in place. Await further instruction. Emergency services are responding. They weren't. The rail yard east of the depot went quiet. No freight movement, no distant horns. Even the highway noise miles away diminished day by day. At first I thought the isolation would keep this place untouched. No population center nearby. No reason for crowds to gather. Just industrial equipment and open desert. But systems fail outward. Fuel shortages push people off main routes. Side roads saw traffic they were never meant to handle. I watched from Tank 2 as cars began appearing on the access road that led toward the old rail spur. Drivers looking for alternate routes, for gas, for something open. Some vehicles turned around when they saw the locked gate. Some didn't. The first group that approached on foot looked exhausted. 3 men. 1 woman. No visible injuries. They rattled the fence and shouted questions. I stayed on the tank and didn't answer. They circled the perimeter once, then twice. Testing for weakness. When they left, I thought that was the end of it. 2 days later, I found blood on the north fence line, not pooled, smeared, like someone had been pressed against the chain link from the outside. That night, the south motion sensor triggered 12 times, short bursts, then longer ones. By morning, there were footprints near the dry wash. Boot prints. And something else. Drag marks in the sand. Whatever crossed that sensor wasn't just wandering. It was pacing the perimeter. And it hadn't tried the gate yet. Once I accepted that the depot wasn't just a remote holdout but a target, I stopped watching and started reinforcing. First priority was the fence. Chain link alone doesn't stop determined movement, it only slows it. I walked the full perimeter with a welding kit and steel scrap pulled from the maintenance shed. Wherever the fence met a post, I added additional tack welds to the brackets. I wired old fuel hose sections through the lower gaps to reduce crawl space. Not pretty work, just functional. On the north side, I drove lengths of rebar at outward angles from the base of the fence. Trip points. Nothing lethal, just enough to catch a boot in low light. The gate was already chained and welded, but I didn't trust hinges. I cut 2 steel beams from a disassembled loading ramp and set them diagonally across the interior gate frame. If someone tried to ram it, the impact would distribute into the concrete pad instead of the hinge bolts. Next was interior control. The loading rack sits between the tanks and the gate. It's open on 3 sides. 2 exposed. I repositioned the forklift fully sideways and lowered its steel forks flat to the ground, creating a waist-high barrier. Then I dragged 2 55-gallon empty drums and filled them with sand to anchor the forklift wheels in place. That created a funnel. Anything coming through the gate would have to pass left of the forklift and into a narrow corridor between the rack supports. From Tank 2's catwalk, that corridor sits directly in my sightline. Height is leverage. I rigged a simple pulley system on the ladder platform so I could haul supplies up without climbing down every time. Less movement on ground level. Less exposure. I moved 2 cases of water and a crate of canned food onto the tank roof and secured them under a tarp weighted with bolts. Power was limited but manageable. The shed had a small backup generator used for pump testing. I drained residual gasoline from the lines and filtered it through cloth. Enough to run the generator in short intervals. I wired extension cords to a low-watt LED strip inside the shed, and one mounted above the door. Light discipline matters. I only run them when necessary. Solar was better. I found 2 portable panels in the maintenance inventory, likely left from a temporary monitoring setup. I mounted them on the west side of Tank 1, angled to catch afternoon sun. They feed a deep-cycle battery I salvaged from the forklift. That battery now powers the motion sensor relay and a handheld radio charger. Water required adjustment. I built a condensation catch under the overflow valves of Tank 3. The temperature swing between day and night causes minor vapor release. Normally insignificant. But by rigging a plastic trough and directing it into sealed containers, I collect a quart or 2 every few days. It tastes metallic. I boil it before drinking. Boiling introduces risk. Open flame near fuel tanks is not negotiable. So I built a small sand-lined pit 40 yards north of the tanks, downwind of prevailing gusts. I keep the fire low and short. I only light it after full daylight when visibility is high. Smoke dissipates quickly in the dry air, but it still signals. Complication came on the 4th night of reinforcement. The south motion sensor stopped blinking. At first I thought the battery had drained. I climbed down and checked the panel. It was intact. Wiring was untouched. The LED inside the shed remained dark even when I walked directly through its field. Someone had adjusted its angle. The bracket bolts were loosened just enough to tilt it upward, sending its detection arc above ground level. Whoever did it knew what they were touching. They didn't smash it. They didn't cut wires. They neutralized it quietly. I tightened the bracket and added a secondary sensor from the maintenance kit. This one lower, hidden in scrub, harder to spot. I didn't check the lower level that night. Instead, I stayed on Tank 2 with binoculars until sunrise. Second complication came 2 days later. Windstorm. High desert storms don't always bring rain. Sometimes just 40-mile-per-hour gusts carrying sand like shrapnel. The western sky darkened mid-afternoon. By dusk, visibility dropped to less than 50 yards. Sand infiltrates everything. It worked its way into the forklift hydraulics, into the generator intake, into my eyes and mouth. More importantly, it masked sound. The fence could have been rattling, and I wouldn't have heard it. During the worst of it, I saw movement through the haze near the dry wash, multiple shapes. Hard to count. Moving unevenly but steadily toward the south fence. They weren't reacting to anything obvious. No engine noise, no fire, just drifting forward like debris caught in current. The storm hit full force before they reached the perimeter. By morning, the sand had drifted against sections of the fence, creating shallow ramps in 2 places. Not high, maybe knee level, but enough to reduce the barrier. I spent the next 6 hours shoveling those drifts away and reinforcing the base with scrap metal sheets wired along the bottom. While I worked, I found something near the south post. Footprints. Fresh. Not from the storm movement. Deep heel impressions. Deliberate spacing. Whoever adjusted the sensor had returned during the wind, and they had stood close enough to the fence to watch me shovel. That realization changed my priorities. I moved one of the solar panels from Tank 1 to a lower mount near the shed, decoy positioning. From a distance, it looks like primary power is ground level. If someone plans sabotage, they'll aim there first. I also ran thin wire between 2 fence posts at ankle height along the south interior, not strong enough to injure, just enough to trip. Then I did something I'd avoided until now. I siphoned fuel from the smallest tank into a shallow trench along the burned access road. Not to ignite immediately, just to have the option. By sunset, everything looked still again. The desert returned to that wide, open quiet that feels safe if you don't look too closely. But just before dark, the secondary motion sensor blinked once. Low. Ground level. And it stayed lit longer than a passing animal would trigger it. At first I thought the battery had drained. I climbed down and checked the panel. It was intact. Wiring was untouched. The LED inside the shed remained dark even when I walked directly through its field. Someone had adjusted its angle. The bracket bolts were loosened just enough to tilt it upward, sending its detection arc above ground level. Whoever did it knew what they were touching. They didn't smash it. They didn't cut wires. They neutralized it quietly. I tightened the bracket and added a secondary sensor from the maintenance kit. This one lower, hidden in scrub, harder to spot. I didn't check the lower level that night. Instead, I stayed on Tank 2 with binoculars until sunrise. Second complication came 2 days later. Windstorm. High desert storms don't always bring rain. Sometimes just 40-mile-per-hour gusts carrying sand like shrapnel. The western sky darkened mid-afternoon. By dusk, visibility dropped to less than 50 yards. Sand infiltrates everything. It worked its way into the forklift hydraulics, into the generator intake, into my eyes and mouth. More importantly, it masked sound. The fence could have been rattling, and I wouldn't have heard it. During the worst of it, I saw movement through the haze near the dry wash, multiple shapes. Hard to count. Moving unevenly but steadily toward the south fence. They weren't reacting to anything obvious. No engine noise, no fire, just drifting forward like debris caught in current. The storm hit full force before they reached the perimeter. By morning, the sand had drifted against sections of the fence, creating shallow ramps in 2 places. Not high, maybe knee level, but enough to reduce the barrier. I spent the next 6 hours shoveling those drifts away and reinforcing the base with scrap metal sheets wired along the bottom. While I worked, I found something near the south post. Footprints. Fresh. Not from the storm movement. Deep heel impressions. Deliberate spacing. Whoever adjusted the sensor had returned during the wind, and they had stood close enough to the fence to watch me shovel. That realization changed my priorities. I moved one of the solar panels from Tank 1 to a lower mount near the shed, decoy positioning. From a distance, it looks like primary power is ground level. If someone plans sabotage, they'll aim there first. IA. The blinking became part of the rhythm. Not constant, not predictable, just often enough to keep my sleep shallow. I started tracking it in a small notebook from the shed. Time of trigger, duration, wind direction, temperature. At first I told myself it was pattern analysis, engineering logic. If I could find a cycle, I could anticipate movement. But the entries began to show something else. The triggers clustered between midnight and 3 a.m., the worst time for clear thinking. I stopped running the generator at night entirely. Darkness became a rule. I sat inside the shed with a red-lensed flashlight and listened. Every shift in the metal walls felt amplified. Every gust against the door made me check the latch. Isolation changes how you process sound. You start assigning intention to random noise. Sand sliding along sheet metal becomes footsteps. Thermal expansion becomes tapping. A loose hinge becomes breathing. I climb tank 2 more often than necessary. From up there the world looks empty. Clean lines, no movement except wind across brush. But the dry wash holds shadow differently at night. Even under starlight, it absorbs detail. That's where the triggers were coming from. 3 nights after the prolonged ground-level sensor activation, I saw something that didn't move like the others. It stood near the wash, just beyond the sensor's arc, not pacing, not drifting, just stationary. I watched for 20 minutes. It shifted weight once. That was all. Infected don't hold position that long without stimulus. They wander. They respond to sound. They cluster and then disperse. The shape held. I didn't use a spotlight. Light draws focus both ways. Instead, I waited. After another 10 minutes, it stepped back into the wash and disappeared from view. The sensor didn't blink. That meant it had stayed outside the detection field on purpose. I wrote that down too. The next morning I found markings near the south fence. Small rocks arranged in a line parallel to the chain link. Not random scatter. Deliberate placement. 4 stones, evenly spaced. Not a symbol I recognized. Not a message I could decode. Just a sign that someone had been close enough to touch the ground within my perimeter view and leave something intentional behind. I kicked the rocks aside. Then I regretted it. If it was communication, I'd erased the first move. I started thinking more about people than infected. Infected are predictable. Sound, movement, proximity. They don't plan, they don't wait, people do. Water supply began to weigh heavier in my thoughts. I had maybe 3 weeks left at current rationing. Condensation capture helped, but not enough. The nearest known well is 12 miles northeast. I had a bicycle in the shed, tires intact. But leaving the depot meant opening the gate. It meant crossing the burned trench on foot. It meant being visible. And if someone was already watching, departure would signal vulnerability. I delayed. Sleep shortened. I began waking before the sensor blinked, as if my body anticipated it. I would lie still on the cot, counting breaths, waiting for the faint click of the LED activating in the corner. Sometimes it came, sometimes it didn't. On the 5th consecutive night of triggers, I heard something new, metal on metal, not fence rattle, not wind. A controlled tap. I froze inside the shed. The sound came again, softer this time. From the south side. 3 taps. Pause. 2 taps. I didn't respond. I climbed tank 2 slowly, staying low against the ladder. From the top I scanned the fence line with binoculars. There. A figure crouched near the base of the chain link, head covered, face obscured, one hand resting lightly on the fence as if feeling vibration. They weren't shaking it. They were listening. I stayed still. After a few minutes, the figure stood and backed away into the wash again. The sensor blinked once as they crossed the arc intentionally. A signal. They wanted me to know they could trigger it. The long-running thread tightened. I started considering the trench of fuel along the access road differently. Originally it was a barrier for infected movement. A last resort ignition line. Now it looked like something else. A statement. If I lit it, I would remove any remaining easy path for vehicles or organized approach. The burned tanker had damaged asphalt but not destroyed the route entirely. With equipment, someone could clear it. If I ignited the trench, the ground would fracture deeper. Heat would warp rebar in the concrete edges. It would be impassable without heavy machinery. It would also broadcast my position again with a smoke column visible for miles, and it would tell whoever was pacing the fence that negotiation was over. The markings returned 2 days later. This time not rocks. Scratches on the chain link. 4 vertical lines etched with something sharp. I found them at dawn while checking the base reinforcement. Not random gouges. Even spacing. Shoulder height. Counting. Or warning. Water inventory dropped below 2 weeks. I stood at the gate one afternoon and studied the burned stretch of road. The blackened asphalt still smelled faintly of diesel when the sun hit it hard. I walked the length of the trench I had dug and considered how quickly flame would travel, fast. Once lit, there would be no controlling it. That night, the tapping returned. 3. Pause. 2. Closer to the gate this time. I didn't climb the tank immediately. I waited longer than I should have. The tapping shifted to the metal beam bracing the interior of the gate. A different tone. Hollow. Testing structure. I pictured someone calculating weld points. Hinge stress. Weakness under heat. If they had tools, they could attempt entry during a windstorm again. Mask noise. Mask movement. I felt the weight of choice settle in. Open communication and risk exposure, or seal the depot permanently and remove temptation entirely. The sensor blinked again. Low. Prolonged. I walked to the shed and picked up the flare gun I had used 3 days earlier. I held it in my hand for a long time before loading it. By the time I stepped back toward the trench, the tapping had stopped. The desert was quiet, but the quiet felt expectant, and I knew that whatever I did next would close one door for good. I didn't shout a warning, didn't make an offer. Negotiation requires trust, and trust requires visibility. I had neither. The trench ran parallel to the burned tanker scar, shallow but continuous. I had tested the fuel spread twice during daylight. It would carry if the wind held steady from the west. It was blowing that way now. I walked the length one final time, checking for gaps. The diesel sheen caught faint starlight, calm surface. Waiting. Halfway down the line, I heard movement near the gate again. Not tapping this time. Footsteps shifting on gravel. Slow. Measured. I didn't look up. If I saw a face, it would complicate things. At the far end of the trench, I knelt and struck the flare against the cap. The ignition hiss sounded louder than it should have in open air. Red light flared against the tanks, painting them in temporary warning. I hesitated longer than I expected. Once it started, the access road would be gone in any practical sense. No vehicles. No quick exit for me either. The bicycle wouldn't cross what this would become. Water would remain a countdown. The footsteps near the gate stopped. I imagined someone watching from the shadows, trying to decide if this was bluff or commitment. I lowered the flare to the fuel line. The ignition wasn't explosive. It crawled at first, then caught in sections, racing along the trench in twin directions. Heat rolled outward. The air tightened. Within seconds, the shallow line became a wall of fire running the length of the road. The asphalt began to bubble. The beams bracing the gate glowed dull red in reflection. I stepped back toward the interior of the depot and waited until the full line was engaged. No gaps, no breaks. On the other side of the flames, I saw a silhouette retreat from the gate, not rushing, not panicked, just stepping back beyond the heat radius. Then it was gone into the wash. The fire burned longer than the tanker had. The trench fed it steadily. When it finally died down near dawn, the road surface had split open in multiple places. Deep cracks, warped edges. The culvert pipe beneath the midpoint sagged where heat had weakened it. No standard vehicle would cross that now. I climbed Tank 2 as the first light came up. Smoke drifted low across the desert. The horizon remained empty, except for the usual scrub and distant mesas. The south sensor blinked once as wind moved debris across its arc. No tapping, no rocks arranged in patterns. Just scorched ground and quiet. I had sealed the depot from outside access by road. I had also sealed myself in. Water remained the variable. The bicycle sat in the shed, still viable for a narrow crossing if I built a plank bridge over the worst of the trench. Possible, but exposed. And whoever had been pacing the fence now knew I was willing to escalate. That knowledge cuts both ways. I don't know if they'll return with more people or decide the cost is too high. I don't know if they were alone to begin with. I only know the road is gone. The gate is intact but symbolic now. Beyond it lies a fracture of burned asphalt that no truck will navigate. Up on the tank, wind moves across the steel and hums like distant machinery that no longer runs. I ration water more strictly starting today. I didn't check the lower level this morning. I stayed up high and watched the wash until the sun cleared the ridge. Out here, isolation used to mean safety. Now it means commitment. And tomorrow depends on who is willing to wait longer.